Well, this is going to be quite an interesting exercise for me, as I'm not used to talking in front of such a big audience. Um, I'd like to actually talk about design from a city perspective, talking mainly about African cities, as I think they're not um, developing the traditional sense of a city usually develops. They're quite organic in what I consider the process they're sort of happening. There's space for negotiation, I think. They're also a reservoir of energy. They gather many people from many different environments, and most of them from many different cultures. And I think that is what specifically makes them organic. In the next slide, I'm showing here a drawing by a Nigerian architect who's he's there portraying the future of Lagos. And what I like about this image is that it shows the pace at which African cities are supposed to grow. This was probably drawn in the early 90s, and sort of envisioning what Lagos would be 20 years down. So there also, you can see that there is a lot of vibrancy, a lot of energy in sort of what we sometimes perceive as chaos. And I think that also in the process of moving and in that motion, self-definition happens. African cities tend to affirm a little more their identity. And to illustrate that, I think I'll switch to the market. And the market as a space that is sort of is a microcosm for all of those energies that are at play in African cities. So looking at the markets, we can directly have an idea of what happens in many African cities. It's, of course, dynamic, not only in the energy, but visually. It also obeys organic rules. Not only in the activity, but also in the trash it produces. And in the, for example, here we have an image that says cleanliness without effort. It's, it's to me, it's sort of the very example of what happens in a lot of African cities, where the public rule is sort of stepping back, and people are becoming more and more in charge of I'm sorry. They have to be more and more in charge of what they produce and how to administer the city. And of course, in such an example, trash is not collected, but certainly taxes are. So I think that sort of illustrates that the cities are moving very fast, and public rule and government administration is not able to keep up with this pace. And often, I would say that African cities, what happens in African cities is that the city dwellers is sort of pushing for a vision, and that vision is usually not really carried out. The administration is not necessarily competent to really respond to the needs of the city. So it savagely occupies space. When you have a very dynamic market, when you sell a lot, when you buy a lot, you also produce a lot of trash. And what I think is interesting about trash is that it's sort of a direct indicator of how healthy a place is. When you're healthy, you produce dejections, and trash in markets, I think, are a very good example of what kind of energy we can find in African cities. The paradox is that millions of dollars transit daily in those places. And I think that's the very reason for the chaotic nature and of those places. But also, I think that absence of public rule has generated a lot of side effects. People have become very aggressive in sort of taking space, in sort of establishing where they feel the need, they feel it's important for them to establish. If you don't occupy the street, for example, you don't sell. If you don't sell, you don't eat. If you don't eat, you can't take care of your health. And of course, you can't rely on the public healthcare system to sort of respond to your health problems, and probably health problems that were created in the first place by the trash that surrounds the environment you're working in. So this was just a quick overview of what I think the environment of the city is in Africa. But now I'm going to switch to design. I'm an architect. This is what I do, and this is probably where I feel most comfortable in. And this is, as you all probably know, it's a mask. And I've had a hard time sort of defining what design is, of course, because you move from smaller scale to bigger scale, and you also move from, if you look at traditional sort of separations of designs, you know, from designer who deals with objects to architects who deal with buildings to you know, urban planners who design cities. And to sort of comprehend on my level what design is, I've sort of decided that design was defined by those three parameters. First one is function. The second one is cost, and the third one is aesthetics. Function, for me, is dealing with the very utilitarian aspect of the object. How do you use it, where do you use it, and what do you use it for? Cost deals with the means of production, technology involved in the making of the object, and aesthetics, which is, I think, the emotional attachment to the object. And to me, the intelligent object is the one that sort of carries all those three parameters in sort of a very balanced dosage. Here is another mask, well, to show you that I think that before masks are a piece of art, they're design object, because I think they were made primarily to fulfill a certain function. And they also fit all those three parameters. They are made by available means to the people who made them, and they certainly do have very strong emotional content. And to switch from masks to what I call savage urban objects, like, for example, this bench and this tool, I think that they carry the similar or very similar qualities in terms of function, in terms of means of production, and also in terms of emotional relationship to the users. What interests me is that for those objects, they have no name designer stamped on them, which probably differs from the next one. This is a chair that got me interested in design. It's one of the first pieces that I started looking at that sort of reminded me what sort of established a connection between what I was doing and the place I was coming from. This is from an Ivorian designer from the 90s, early 90s, and it was published in this periodical called Revue Noire during the 90s, which was sort of gathering all examples of African contemporary art. And obviously, when you look at this chair, you can tell that it's derived from the very well-known African chair made of two planks of wood put together, one of them acting as the seat and the other as the back. And actually, after years of making objects and traveling and winning prizes and going places, showing my work, it's sort of and also having conversations with friends, and especially with one specific friend, it sort of occurred to me that what we were trying to define as African design was really lacking the very quality that a lot of street objects had. It was not connected to the people we were making it for. And they were considered to be pretty objects. They were, at best, considered interesting by probably mostly aware public and mostly Western. And back home, they were considered elitist and not really connected directly to our environment. Probably too expensive to produce and not enough connected to daily use. So there we were sort of experiencing the limits of our own creations. And it sort of occurred to us that maybe we'd been too busy making stuff, and as designer, we should have been looking a little more on what was happening on the streets and in the markets. Here, for example, this is an image of a trolley that's made out of used tires and planks of wood. And those are used a lot in Abidjan, that's where I'm from, and I suspect in many other African cities, or at least similar objects in their quality. What I find interesting in those objects is the sort of connection they have to the people who use them. They're quite easy to make, and they fulfill the function. We have sort of a similar idea with here calabash display unit in the market. I probably, with training as a designer, would not have thought of this way to display calabashes, but apparently it works very well. And this is what I call the human vending machine that we often see in many African cities. At traffic jam, as soon as you stop, you have all those people bringing all sorts of goods that you probably don't need in the first place at a very competitive price. And it's quite effective. It's quite effective in the way they connect to the people, in the way sometimes you would stop at traffic and you'd feel like you're in a big mall with all those people and all those goods. This is to illustrate what I was saying earlier. This is the chair I made in the mid-90s. And I think that instead, I had been making objects, such as this one, and though they carried elements of, I would say, humor and aesthetics and materials connected to the city, they still did not have the dexterity, intelligence of the objects we found on the street. Like, for example, well, this is another chair I made. For example, this one. This one is sort of a seat from a chair that is sitting on a brick. And this had been in front of my apartment building for a long time, and it's used by the people around to sit at noon and congregate. And in a way, I was sort of fascinated with the immediateness, the low technicity with which it was put together, by just gathering random objects. And it is to actually emphasize the fact that we were not really, while making those pretty objects, not really connecting to the people. This is another stool that is made out of woods gathered here and there. That's a crate. And this is what I think is becoming interesting. With time, objects, gathered from here and there are finally converging into making something else. This is a shoe polish booth in the city of Abidjan, where you can go and sit and have your shoe polished, and have a Coke, and this is sponsored by Coca-Cola. Of course, you find them all over the city. And I think that they sort of relate well to the energy that we find in our cities. And also, like if you look next to the Coca-Cola booth, you would see that all those plastic objects, although not necessarily gathered in very organized fashion, do participate in a way to the occupation of sidewalks that I was talking earlier. And it also occurred to us that materials like plastic had been legitimate participants of our daily scenery. And for example, here you would see plastic shoes, and those objects, I think, again, connected better to the people in the environment than the ones we made. So we sort of went back and thought a little bit and decided that maybe it was time we started looking at what was around us, instead of making. And this is a cell phone booth. And what we found interesting in this one is that it was sort of an interesting marriage between the low-tech technicity used to put those together and the high technicity of the cell phone that worked together hand in hand to sort of accomplish the mission of the future, I would say. And similar contrast is also seen as in video game booths in the market. And I think that all those examples should leave us with a few lessons, that specifically to produce sustainable development, we need to sort of approach notions like progress and development with another eye. We need to reinvent those notions. We need to revisit them and sort of think more of a mix between what we have here on the continent with sort of very simple technology and very simple way of putting things. We need to maybe sort of merge that low-tech technicity with more high-tech, with more example of high-tech. And to illustrate that, I would say that some of what we produce here on the continent, out of what we often think of lack of means, is sometimes as equal, if not more valuable, to some of the most incredible, sophisticated objects. I believe that technology is great, though, but it's even greater, when its application corresponds to the problematic it faces. We probably need to observe more and should not be completely blinded by our ego and the things that we're making and technology that we're producing. And the world progress probably needs a good dose of spontaneous human intelligence to realize that many of the answers to the questions that we're asking ourselves are just around the corner. Thank you very much.